مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل 60 عاما من هذا السيف أمام جمال عبد الناصر قناة السويس، وبعدها بأشهر قليلة حاولت القوى الاستعمارية القديمة متمثلة في بريطانيا وفرنسا استعادتها. ما لا يذكره معظم الشرق الأوسطيين عن تلك الواقعة أنها لم تكن الهدف الوحيد الذي شهده العالم آنذاك. في نفس الأسبوع الذي اندلعت فيه حرب السويس، أرسل السوفيت دباباتهم إلى الدولة المجار الشرق أوروبية، مذكرين العالم أنهم قوة كبرى. وبعد 60 عاما ما يزال الروس يذكرون العالم أنهم قوة كبرى. دباباتهم تقدر في أوكرانيا وطائراتهم تهلك في سوريا. قد لا يملكون نفس التطلعات العالمية التي امتلكوها في ظل النظام السوفيتي، ولكن بعد 20 عاما لم تكن لهم فيها أهمية. أدى الروس دون شك إطرافا فاعلة على الساحة الدولية. هل تصرفات روسيا منبعها القوة أم الضعف؟ وماذا ينبغي أن يكون رد فعل أمريكا؟ لمناقشة أمر روسيا والسياسة الأمريكية اليوم، يسرني أن أرحب بواحدة من أرفع خبراء الدفاع المعنيين بالشؤون الروسية في إدارة أوباما، وهي إيفلين فاركس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today our focus is Russia. Russia in the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and American-Russian relations. I'm delighted to have Evelyn Farkas with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So how do we describe Russia? Friend, ally, adversary, enemy? What is Russia?
Well, first of all, Russia is a major power on the international stage, and they're trying to prove that more and more every day. We see them getting involved at all levels, all over the place. I think it depends on the context, whether they're, acting competitively or cooperatively. So in the case of dealing with Iran's nuclear programs, we saw them operating cooperatively with us in a diplomatic setting. In the case of Syria, which I'm sure we'll get into, it's much more complex, and I would say there we are not operating cooperatively. In the case of Europe writ large, there's some competition as well because of their actions towards their neighbors, which we disagree with because they're violating the sovereignty of many of their direct neighbors. So that's kind of my short answer.
Well, let me ask you on one other level. I mean, there was a time when Americans woke up fearing some Russian Soviet leader could press a button and that would be it. Does Russia today still have the power to do that to America?
Yes, militarily, of course they do. They still have nuclear weapons. They have a strategic nuclear arsenal. We have strategic nuclear deterrence with Russia. They also have tactical nuclear weapons, which could be a problem in the European context. They violated actually the INF Treaty, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which bans intermediate missiles, which you could couple up, I guess, with a nuclear weapon and strike our European allies. So they are a threat technically from a military perspective, but it all depends on what their intent is. And that's where we get into some problems because, as I mentioned earlier, we're not always cooperating with Russia and their intent towards us is not always friendly. So I think on the nuclear front we have pretty good deterrence with them, but we have to keep our eye on that as well. And then on the conventional side, it's more troubling.
And so when you put aside the nuclear issue for a moment, is Russia a powerful state or is Russia a weak state? One hears two competing narratives about Russia.
Economically, there's no doubt about it. Russia is weak and weakening, so that's why you often hear Russia's declining power, a declining power. But Russia will never disappear entirely. There are a lot of people who say, well, we can just ignore Russia because they're declining, as if somehow that means they're going to disappear. It's a huge country with a lot of potential. They're not going to achieve that potential in the near future under this government, but in the future they could actually grow more economically. There's a lot they would have to change in their system. So economically, as I mentioned, declining. Politically and geopolitically, diplomatically, they have a lot of influence because they have, first of all, a near oil and gas monopoly in Europe. So they use that influence vis-a-vis their neighbors, as I mentioned, but also elsewhere. They make and sell quite a lot of military armaments, and so they have allies that they sell arms to that perhaps cannot get arms, for example, from the West. And so they exercise their influence that way as well. So I would say that Russia is economically declining, but continues to have political heft. And so therefore, when our interests are not aligned, Russia can be quite a challenge for the United States.
And if you were to look at the Russian political system, I asked earlier how you would characterize Russia as a state. How would you characterize their political system? Is Russia a democracy? Is it a dictatorship?
No.
Is it? How would you? What term would you use?
I would say it's not technically a democracy. Sure, they have elections, but they're not actually free and fair. So it's a government controlled by a small group inside the Kremlin. At the top is Vladimir Putin. The security establishment has ultimate control. So I would say it's an autocracy. And it's also coupled by an economic system which is not a free market economy. So while Russia is connected to the global economy, their economic system is very corrupt and it's very much controlled by the government. So it's a kind of an oligarchic, I wouldn't say, again, not centrally controlled, but highly corrupt and very much an influence-based and government influence-based economy.
How would you say the Russian leadership, Putin in this case, or Russian intelligence, views America? It views America at the waning days of the Obama administration.
Right. Well, this is part of the problem because Putin and his group in the Kremlin, they very much view the United States as an adversary. I mean, like it or not, and we can say till we are blue in the face that we are not Russia's adversary. We don't want to be Russia's adversary. And that is true. We do not want to be Russia's adversary. But the Putin regime, his government, they have decided we are an adversary. Why? Because we want the countries in the Russian neighborhood, so European countries, to have the right to decide for themselves what kind of governments they have. So if they want a real democracy, like the Ukrainian people demonstrated 2 years ago when they went to the streets that they want a real democracy, they should have that right. If they want to be affiliated with the European Union or to join NATO, we believe, the United States and our allies, that those countries should have that right to make that choice and to make a bid to become a member of NATO or the European Union. Russia does not think that those countries should have that choice. And they're doing everything, including invading and seizing territory of the neighboring countries, to block those countries' right to do so. So in that sense, we're clearly in an adversarial relationship with Russia because we have a different perspective about democracy, about sovereignty. And then there's the issue of regime change, whereby the Russian government really believes that the international community should not have the right to go in and change regimes, even if the regime is an autocratic, dictatorial, brutal, murderous regime like you have in Syria. So we have these fundamental disagreements with Russia that put us in this adversarial relationship.
And is it correct, or is it an exaggeration to describe this adversarial relationship as another Cold War?
It's not correct because, as I mentioned, it doesn't extend to every situation or every issue. So as I mentioned before, and I think it's important to note, the Russians really do care about stemming proliferation of nuclear weapons to new countries. So in the case of Iran, they really do not want Iran to become a nuclear power, and they joined with us and our other allies in the UN context to stop the Iranians from getting a nuclear program. I mean, that remains to be seen ultimately whether we've succeeded, but I think we've made the first very good move in that direction with the Iran nuclear agreement. The problem is that, so as I mentioned, so that's a difference from the Cold War. The other difference is that the Russian people are not completely walled off, as they were during the Soviet time. So you couldn't travel if you were a citizen of the Soviet Union. You were pretty much stuck in the Soviet Union unless you got special permission to travel overseas, and they knew that you would come back. They were very sensitive about people leaving. Now it's very fluid. Russian citizens can come and go from Russia. There is an economic trade between Russia and the world. So number one, the Russian citizens and the Russian country is not blocked off. We don't also have the same ideological standoff that we had, where we were trying to, bring on new countries as recruits, and the Russians were trying to bring on new countries as recruits, and it was a standoff between communism and democracy. Today we don't have that. Putin doesn't really have people that he's wooing or countries that he's wooing into his camp. Yes, there might be leaders who say, hey, I want to be like Vladimir Putin, I want to be rich, and I want to be able to tell these companies, what they can do, and then take some of the money for myself and build a nice palace and tell the press what they can say or not say and have propaganda. But those are a couple of leaders who say, okay, I might want to emulate Vladimir Putin. But the people living in countries don't say, hey, we want the Russian way of life. And we, the United States, are not trying to tell people to have the American way of life. We're just saying, if you want to be democratic within your country, we will support that, because that's always been America's way. So it's different from the Cold War. And again, as I mentioned also, we do look to cooperate with Russia where possible, because we don't want an overall adversarial relationship.
Okay, very good. When we come back with Evelyn Farkas, we're going to focus on specific areas of clash between America and Russia, especially in Syria, in just a moment. Our guest today is Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Evelyn is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington. She served until late 2015 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. The Pentagon's senior official focused on this important region of the world. She served previously as senior advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and as special advisor to the Secretary of Defense for the NATO summit. Prior to that, Evelyn served as executive director of the congressionally mandated Bipartisan Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation and Terrorism, and as a professional staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. In her career, she has taught at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College and served as human rights officer and election observer in Bosnia and Afghanistan. Evelyn, who received her master's and doctoral degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, is the author of Fractured States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Iraq, Ethiopia, and Bosnia in the 1990s. And I think it's important to point out, she speaks fluent Hungarian and German, as well as, well, pretty good French, Spanish, Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, and get this, Hindi. So,
I just studied the last bunch of those, including Russian, but I studied them.
Good enough. Okay, let's focus on Syria.
Yes.
Why is Russia engaged in protecting this genocidal dictator who is destroying his country in Syria?
There are a couple of reasons. One of Russia's key objectives is to demonstrate that Russia is a global power on par with the United States and its allies. So in becoming engaged in Syria, and this dates back to even before their most recent engagement, which is the military engagement that started in September, even before that, they were engaged in Syria in the defense of Bashar al-Assad. If you recall the chemical weapons deal, where basically the Russians came in and came up with this proposal that we remove the chemical weapons from Syria. So they've been engaged for a number of years. Before that, of course, they had the military presence in Tartus, and they have always had some Russian military folks in there advising the Syrian military. Part of that was because they had been selling military equipment to the Syrian government. So there's there's one, to show that they're a global power. We're here in the Middle East. We have something to say about this. Two, they have had this support for the Syrian government and therefore some influence, and also, of course, some weapons sales. And then there's also the issue of regime change. So for the Russian government, for the Kremlin, and President Putin in particular, the issue of regime change is very sensitive and feels to him very personal. And so he has really gone on almost a crusade to stop regime change in places like the Middle East, where Russia has an interest, And what I mean by that is basically the international community, he believes, should not come in and get rid of a leader, no matter how bloody, brutal, abusive that leader is, no matter how disaffected the people are with that leader. The international community should not remove that leader. And so Putin is also kind of making a stand in defense of that principle. He wants to rewrite the international rules of the road. Because as you know, we have had now a history, the international community, of going in to help citizens if their leader is as brutal and as bloody and murderous and dictatorial as Bashar al-Assad is. And Libya was kind of the most recent example, but we have other ones going back.
Given your experience in Ukraine, how much of what's going on in Syria do you connect to what Russia's ambitions are in Europe?
I don't think they're that closely connected, although I will say that Russia found itself by September of 2015 in a situation in Ukraine that had stabilized more or less, meaning there was some ongoing skirmishing in eastern Ukraine. They had full control, although illegal, of Crimea, and they weren't making much progress there. They were a little bit bogged down. And I think Putin saw the opportunity to make a stand, to basically rally the forces, rally the nationalistic forces within his population. So I haven't mentioned that before, but the other element, what's really important to Putin and the Kremlin, is staying in power. And one of the ways that they do this now, because, as I mentioned earlier, economically they're not doing very well, is to demonstrate to the people that he's going to make Russia great again on the international stage, and so to appeal to Russian nationalism. And that's also part of what's going on in Syria, is he's showing that your military can do this in Syria. Look how effective we are. Because in Ukraine, it's sort of a standoff. It doesn't look that great anymore. They had a lot of TV there. They were showing what they were doing in Ukraine. Now they've switched. They'll show Syria. But it also may have been, initially at least, an attempt by Putin to say to the West, look, you got to deal with me, and maybe you should give me a free hand in Ukraine, in exchange for I might compromise with you in Syria. So there was, I think, that thinking there also in the Kremlin, that hope, which may not be entirely dead, but I think in the early days he may have thought he could make some kind of deal on Ukraine, and on sanctions in particular. Because Russia is under strong EU sanctions. They don't like those sanctions at all because of what they've done in Ukraine. And so they may have tried to think about a barter. But I don't think that's coming to fruition.
Is this a good deal? Would this be a good deal for America?
No, because first of all, in the case of Ukraine, we have real principles at stake. As I mentioned, we believe that it's the Ukrainian states and the Ukrainian people's sovereign right to decide whether they want to become part of the European Union or not. And certainly it's their right to defend their territory and not to have foreign troops invade and seize parts of their territory. So we stand behind the firm decision that we've made, a policy decision, to defend Ukraine's right to its territory, which means they still own Crimea, despite the fact that it's under occupation. And in eastern Ukraine, we have the Minsk process, it's called, which is a diplomatic process that ultimately should lead to the Russian troops leaving, because there are Russian military troops there, disarmament of the separatists, and then, of course, some self-determination there, because at the heart of it, what the Russians have alleged is a grievance on the part of the ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine, which is not entirely unfounded, which is why, again, the international community is in support of the Ukrainian government taking some actions to make those citizens a little bit more empowered.
One also hears quite a bit about Russian fear of the spread of Islamic extremism in its own neighborhood, inside the Russian Federation and neighboring states. Is this a serious fear on the part of the Kremlin?
I think it should be to some extent, but I don't think it is as much as they say it is. And the reason I say this is because when I was in government for 3 years, we talked to the Russians all the time about cooperating on counterterrorism. And the Russians would say, yes, let's cooperate on counterterrorism. And then when it came time to actually make that real in some way, shape, or form, which usually starts with sharing intelligence, maybe setting up some operations together. We proposed doing it in Afghanistan. We certainly were willing to work with the Russians in the context of the Sochi Olympics, which, as you recall, were held in Sochi, Russia. in 2014, and we said, let's cooperate on, exchanging intelligence there in order to protect everyone who was attending the Sochi Olympics. And in all these examples that I just gave you, the Russians would talk the talk, but when it came down to actually making a plan and actually cooperating, they were nowhere to be found. So I was skeptical when they said, okay, we're going into Syria because we want to cooperate on the fight against Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, the radical Islamic terrorists, because I had not seen the Russians actually work cooperatively with us on counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. And okay, so we waited a little bit to see, are they going to actually target those terrorists that we're targeting, the terrorists? And they didn't. And again, we've seen over time, it didn't take very long for those of us who didn't trust the Russians to identify the fact that they were there really just to help the Syrian regime. But for others, it took a little longer. I think it's pretty obvious now that the Russians are not interested in cooperating with us to fight terrorism in the Middle East.
Very good. Evelyn Farkas, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Dakhel,
Thanks for
Washington.
having me. Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التنافس بين روسيا وأمريكا في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.